I'm very honored to be here tonight. I really appreciate the invitation to come and talk to your group. And as you can see from this slide, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the evolution of flight, going from the transformation from basically dinosaurs that were running around on the ground to birds that can fly. And so, just to tell you a little bit about my lab, if I can get my slides to advance. There we go. So, my lab is basically trying to understand the relationship between, trying to understand the relationship between the structure, the neuroanatomy of the brain, integrating that with kind of more experimental data about how animals are actually using their brains during functions or behaviors. And then what's unique about my lab is that we put this into a broader evolutionary context so that we can understand something about the origins of behaviors and how these relationships between these different things might actually change through time. So we use the fossil record to do this. And my research really concentrates, if I can get, I can't, I'm having a hard time finding my cursor to advance. There we go. My research really concentrates within this group called amniotes. And amniotes include both mammals, so we're amniotes, but it also includes reptiles. And the way we're using reptiles here is inclusive of birds. And it's within amniotes that we see several instances of increase in brain size. Of course, within mammals, we have very large brains, but within reptiles, birds also have very large brains. And we can look at this a little bit more quantitatively. This is a chart of relative brain sizes. So along that X or the horizontal axis, we have body size, and along the Y, the vertical axis, we have brain size. And so just a very simple chart here. This polygon describes the range of variation, or basically it encompasses the range of variation of relative brain sizes for squamates. And of course, squamates include lizards and snakes. We can look at another polygon here for mammals. And so this would encompass the range of variation in relative brain sizes for mammals. And what this is essentially saying is that for any given body size, a mammal is going to have a larger brain size than a lizard or a snake would. Now let's add birds in here. And here's the polygon describing birds. So you can see there is just absolute overlap between that bird distribution and the mammal distribution. So these really are comparable in size. And the mammal distribution is actually even being skewed a little bit because here we are as humans, and of course, we have very large brains for our body size. But if we look at a few other mammals, we can see that a rabbit falls right in the middle of that bird distribution. This is a primate. This is a galago. And again, within that distribution of bird brain sizes, and even some primates that are more closely related to us, like the Cercopithecine monkey, it still is, at the very upper limit, but still within that range of variation for birds. And this is a pattern that if we look at like neuron numbers, we'd see a similar pattern. Even structure of the brain is similar between these two groups. So this slide is showing a primate brain on the left, a bird brain on the right, and again we see a lot of similarities between these brains. So both primates and birds reduce the size of their olfactory bulbs. Olfactory bulbs are what are processing smell. So neither primates nor birds can really smell that well, is essentially what this is saying. They both reduce their olfactory system somewhat. Other mammals, of course, like dogs, they still have a very large olfactory bulbs relative to the rest of their brain. Both mammals and birds have a large and complex cerebrum. And the cerebrum is essentially where all cognitive, not all, but a lot of cognitive functions happen. So this is the part of the brain that's responsible for thinking and planning out future actions. Both birds and mammals have a large folded cerebellum, and the cerebellum is the part of the brain that is responsible for planning and coordinating movements. So it's a very important part, obviously, a very important part of the brain. Both primates and birds reduce the size of their medulla. Not that exciting, actually, but it happens. And then there are some things that are not that are obvious differences as well. So birds are really visual animals. They have these big eyes, and they also have these really large optic lobes. So birds are using as primates are too, but birds are really very visual animals. Um, and so all of these similarities, we can actually say, or not all of these similarities, but many of these similarities between birds and mammals are the products of convergent evolution, or they evolved independently of each other. And we can say that because we have a pretty good idea of what the amniote tree actually looks like. And if you look at birds' closest living relatives, if you look at the brain of a crocodilian, it actually really does not look a whole lot like a bird brain at all. In fact, crocodilians have these very large olfactory bulbs. In fact, they're almost the same size as the cerebrum. They're at the end of these what are called very long olfactory tracts. Crocodilians have a relatively small, unfolded cerebellum, and it just overall you have this very elongate shape. So what we can say is that what this tells us is that within this part of the tree here, from that split at Archosauria between crocodilians and birds, and then all the way up to the evolution of the modern bird radiation, we can say it's somewhere in this part of the tree that the modern bird brain takes shape. And really, what I'm interested in is what are the volumetric and structural changes that produce the modern bird brain? Because just like mammals, the bird brain can support all sorts of really complex behaviors. So birds are social animals, or many of them are. They can use tools. Um, they can, my favorite, my favorite kind of I don't know if it's a behavior, but my favorite thing that birds can do is some pigeons, they've tested pigeons and they can tell the difference between figurative and abstract art, which I always thought was very interesting. But of course, they also have the kind of a stereotypical or iconic bird behavior of powered flight. And so that's really what I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the talk. But again, it's within this part of the tree here. It's about 140 million years that brain takes shape. Now, this part of the tree is actually defined by extinction. So how do we ever know anything about what happens within this part of the tree? Of course, this is where fossils come in. This is where fossils come into play. And okay, there we go. So I'm going to just talk briefly about some of the field work that I've done to collect fossils. So I've been lucky enough to go out to the Gobi Desert in Mongolia to collect in the early and late Cretaceous there. And I've done this as part of the American Museum of Natural History joint expeditions with the Mongolian Institute of Paleontology. Now, American museums started going out to the Gobi. Many of you may know this already, but they started going out to the Gobi in the 1920s. This guy, Henry Fairfield Osborn, actually thought that there would be early humans in the Gobi. He was wrong, but he sent Roy Chapman Andrews out there to look for early humans. He didn't find any humans, but he did find really amazing dinosaur fossils. In fact, some of the most iconic fossils have came from this expedition. So Velociraptor was found by Roy Chapman Andrews on this expedition on these expeditions. And they're really interesting expeditions to talk about because, again, they were doing this in the 1920s, not too far after the automobile had been, had been invented. And they decided to drive out in the Gobi. And so they used cars to go across the desert. And the way they would do this is that they would send these very long camel caravans out in front of them. And so these camel caravans would actually drop supplies along the way. So they would go out ahead of the cars, drop supplies, and then by the time the cars caught up with them, they would have everything they needed to go collect for a few weeks in a certain spot. And the camel caravans would just keep going and keep dropping supplies along the way. So it was a really interesting way to run an expedition. But like I said, some of the most iconic fossils came out of these expeditions. Now, these expeditions actually ended when Mongolia became a satellite country of the Soviet Union. And of course, not surprisingly, American Museum of Natural History was no longer welcome to come and collect fossils there. It didn't stop like there was still collecting going on, but they were being done by Russian and Polish paleontologists primarily. But in 1991, the American Museum of Natural History was invited back in once the Soviet Union fell. And these are the expeditions that I've been lucky enough to be a part of. So they were primarily run by these two guys right here. These are Mark Norell and Mike Novacek of the American Museum. They're both curators at the American Museum. And, not much has really changed since those early days. So our cars still get stuck in the mud. It's a little easy, probably a little easier to pull them out these days, but it still happens probably too often. We still have to deal with things like giant sandstorms. I'm not sure how well this shows up on a computer screen, but this is the leading edge of what was just an incredibly huge sandstorm. A lot of the people that are living in the Gobi, a lot of the Mongolians still live a nomadic lifestyle. Think a little bit, this is kind of a very idyllic picture, but a lot of these what are called gers, or yurts have satellites on top of them and solar panels and everything. So things have modernized a bit since the 20s. But they still have camels out there too. So it's really just an amazing sight to see. And the other thing that hasn't changed is we still find amazing fossils in the Gobi. And so this is Mark Norell collecting, if I remember correctly, this is a small mammal fossil. This would be a late Cretaceous mammal fossil. And this is one of the Mongolian students, Mugi, who has gone out with us multiple times. But we also find incredible dinosaurs. Oops, let's go back for a moment. So these are two dinosaurs that I was lucky enough to be able to publish on. The Con McKenna are just two beautiful oviraptorosaurs, beautifully articulated. They're just incredible specimens. And then the Psittacosaurus on the top is, again, one of my favorite specimens because it's probably only about, I would say, like 6 to 8 inches long. So this is a baby Psittacosaur, and just perfectly complete. So we find all sorts of amazing fossils in the Gobi Desert. But I've also been lucky enough to go a few other places as well. I've also collected in the late Cretaceous of Romania in Transylvania. It's a very, very different field site from Mongolia. Instead of collecting in the desert where it's heavily vegetated, and we're basically collecting mostly in cut banks of streams. And then also, we've also been leading expeditions out to Western Colorado in the Jurassic of Colorado, a little bit closer, a little closer to home. And this is an amazing locality too, because instead of finding these big dinosaurs, we're finding very small animals like lizards and small mammals, and little small crocodilians as well. So it's a really unique locality. But it's this type of field work that really helps us fill out this evolutionary tree. And so within this space here, where I said that modern bird brain takes shape, this is where all of these things like the pterosaurs and all of the non-avian dinosaurs fall. So things, the ornithischians like Triceratops, theropods like T-Rex, even much more velociraptor there, and even much more bird-like things like Archaeopteryx. And so with this fossil record that actually continues to get denser and denser, what we can do is we can actually understand the deep history of these characters that initially we thought were very, kind of stereotypical bird characters. And what we find is that they have this deep history. And so let's take something like feathers, right? Feathers are iconic bird characters. And yet, feathers there are feather-like structures in pterosaurs, so feathers may actually evolve before dinosaurs even do. So they have this like just incredibly deep history. How the wishbone, I'm sure most people have broken apart a wishbone at Thanksgiving. It's actually an important part of the flight apparatus in birds and acts like a spring to propel the wings back up. But the wishbone is essentially just fused clavicles. So we have clavicles right here. Um, and in birds, they fuse together, but they actually fuse together in theropods. And so Tyrannosaurus Rex had a wishbone. Probably it wasn't being used in a flight stroke, but they had fused clavicles nonetheless. And we can even see behaviors in the fossil record sometimes. So this is an oviraptorosaur that is actually sitting or brooding on top of a nest of eggs. And so it's just like we see within modern birds, but this is a dinosaur that, went extinct about 90 million years ago. And in fact, it probably died protecting its eggs. And so the fossil record really helps us understand the deep history of these behaviors. But what about the brain, right? The brain is this soft tissue character, it doesn't preserve well in the fossil record. There are probably, I don't know, a handful of instances where you actually get brain tissue preserved in the fossil record. And the only ones I can think of are actually within fish, so things that were preserved in very special conditions. Um, at the floor of the ocean. Well, this is actually where what we call endocasts come into play. And so is essentially essentially an infilling of the cranial cavity where the brain would have sat during the life of the animal. And we can make endocasts pretty easily these days using CT scans. And so the way this works is that in animals like birds and mammals, whose brain fills the majority of the cranial cavity, it actually leaves an impression on the surrounding bones. And so if you can fill in that space and then get rid of those bones around the cranial cavity, you have a cast of what the brain would have looked like during the life of the animal. And so, like I said, we can do this digitally using CT scans. So just like a medical CT scan, except the scanners that we use produce much higher energy beams. So nothing that you would want to have. You wouldn't want to be scanned with this CT scanner. But like I said, we can just essentially erase the bones around the cranial cavity and then stack up these images and produce models of what the brain would have looked like. And so it's really easy to do this for living animals. So at the top is the albatross that we were looking at the scans of. And you can see this endocast looks very much like the bird brain that I showed you earlier. But we can also do this for this Oviraptorosaur dinosaur that went extinct over 90 million years ago. And now we have an idea of what its brain looked like during its lifetime, which I still find kind of amazing. All right, and here's just a display of some of the different, some of the endocasts of some of these non-avian dinosaurs, except for the hornbill over here, which is a living bird. But we can do it for we've done this for troodontids and tyrannosauroids, pseudopodius, the dinosaur that I just showed you, and even Archaeopteryx, which is a very famous fossil because I think it was discovered, I think 1862, if I'm correct. I might be a year or two off there. But Darwin predicted that you would find these transitional fossils. And then not long after he wrote the Origin of Species in 1859, they found Archaeopteryx. And it was exactly what he predicted that they would find. So it was a dinosaur-like animal with bird-like feathers. So a beautiful, beautiful example of a transitional fossil. But once we have these endocasts, then we can start asking more interesting questions. And so I told you before that birds have significantly larger brains than other reptiles. So one question that I was interested in is where does that shift, or where does that jump in brain size occur on the tree? And so my colleagues and I put together a data set of over, this is not just non-avian dinosaurs, which are right here, but we put together a data set that include endocasts and brain sizes for over 1,200 birds. So we were actually also looking at patterns within living birds. But I'm going to stick to the dinosaurs really today, or the non-avian dinosaurs, I should say. And so here I'm not going to make you kind of interpret that other tree. It's a little big. But here's a summary of that previous tree. And so here, a little bit further, these names that are a little bit further to the left, these are the non-avian dinosaurs. And then the names over here that are shown further to the right, those are groups of living birds. And so I was asking this question, where do we see this jump in brain size on the tree? And it's actually within this group called Paraves. And Paraves includes dinosaurs like Velociraptor and Troodon. It includes Archaeopteryx, but it also includes living birds. What's really interesting is that we don't see another significant shift or increase in brain size until we get well into living birds. And what this means is that birds like ostriches and emus and chickens and ducks and even flamingos and pigeons have a similar relative brain size, so it'd be relative to their body size. They have a similar relative brain size to something like Velociraptor. Now, I don't know if that means that, Velociraptor was really smart, or pigeons and ducks are not as smart, but you know, it, you could look at it. You could look at it either way, I suppose. Um, but we can let's look at a few comparisons here, kind of getting a real kind of conceptualizing what this actually looks like. So here is an illustration of the relative brain size of an African elephant compared to that of Tyrannosaurus rex. And obviously, African elephants are very smart, and they do have a very large brain, and they have a very large cerebrum, as a matter of fact. And it's obviously larger than Tyrannosaurus rex. But I have to tell you that when we put this figure together, I was actually kind of surprised at how large the brain of T-Rex actually was. I had imagined that it would look smaller relative to its brain size. So you also have to remember, that this is before that significant increase. So Tyrannosaurus rex was not part of that paravian group that we saw that significant increase in, but still not bad, especially when you're comparing to something like an African elephant, which has a very large brain for its body size. But now let's see how T-Rex actually compares to some of these paravian dinosaurs. So at the bottom is a troodontid dinosaur. And so once again, we can see about how big the brain relative to at least the skull size was for T-Rex. Now, when we look at this pair avian, it's pretty strikingly different. The pair avian really does have a much larger relative brain size than Tyrannosaurus Rex did. It looks it actually looks very bird-like. Okay, so we can talk about brain sizes, but what makes it more interesting is to understand how brain size actually relates to behavior. And so, as I mentioned, I was particularly interested in how brain size and flight relate to each other. If we expect that if we expect that an increase in brain size is related to the ability to fly, then we would expect both of these things to change at the same point on the tree. So we expect that this brain size increase would correspond to the evolution of flight. And so let's talk a little bit about flight for a moment. I'm going to switch the tree up on you. I apologize for that. We're going to flip things around a little bit. So we can actually look here. So this orange box now is our group of living birds. So we know that living birds can fly, and that the ancestor of living birds could fly. And we know that Archaeopteryx, this fossil that I mentioned before, more than likely was capable of some type of flight. It might not have been a very good flyer, but it had some capacity for flight. So what this means is we can at least bring this ability for powered flight down to this group called Aviale right here. Oops. We can pull it down to this group called Aviale. Now, what you may not know is that some of these things outside of Aviale also probably had the ability to fly. So it's some dromaeosaurs, things closely related to Velociraptor and even some troodontids, um, probably had the ability for powered flight. So actually flapping flight. Not all of them, but you probably see, but based on calculations taken from the postcranial skeleton, many of these dinosaurs might have been able to, or were potentially able to fly. So we could pull flight potential at least um, down to this group called pair aves. So again, powered flight potential, not necessarily that all of these things were flying, but some of these things probably could fly within this group called pair aves. And well, that's exactly where we saw brain size increase, right? So we also saw that substantial increase in brain size at pair AB. So perhaps there is this relationship between brain size and flight. Now, the one problem with that is that, remember, relative brain size is made up of two variables. So it's made up of absolute brain size and absolute body size. And when we look at these two variables independently on the tree, what we find is that at pair AVs, both brain size and body size are going down. It's just that body size is going down fast, is decreasing faster than brain size. And so what you end up with is a overall larger relative brain size. But what's probably happening here is that body size is what's being selected for. So a smaller body size is probably being selected for here at pair AVs. And that would be related to the evolution of flight itself. So it would be advantageous to be smaller if you're going to be flying around, right? And so what might be more informative to look at instead of looking at relative brain size would be to look at how particular brain regions are changing in size and structure relative to the evolution of flight, which of course makes a lot of sense. And this kind of brings me into some of the more experimental work, trying to understand how birds are actually using their brain during flight. So this helps us understand which regions would we expect to be changing or increasing or decreasing in size relative to the evolution of flight. And so you would actually be very surprised. So when I first thought of doing this, I thought there would be lots of literature out there talking about how birds are using their brains during flight, but there was actually very little literature. And so this, as I mentioned, kind of brought me into some more experimental work, actually using positron emission tomography or PET scanning to create activity maps of the brain of flying birds. And so, what this allows us to do is to draw this direct line of inference from the activity patterns in the brain to the structure of the structure of the brain, and then finally to the deep history of the brain that we see in endocasts. And so I'll just run you through quickly how we did these experiments. This is, for some reason, the only picture that we have of our experiments. You can see it was a very technical setup. We have our tree with the white bucket and branch there. But what we would do is we would inject the birds with a radio tracer, and it actually doesn't hurt the birds because it's the same radio tracer that we use in humans when we PET scan humans. So it doesn't actually hurt the birds. We would inject them. We would let them either sit on the bucket for 10 minutes or fly back and forth between buckets for 10 minutes or so. And then we would anesthetize them and put them in a small animal PET scanner to see which parts of their brain would light up. Oh yeah, there's the pigeon, if you're wondering. So we did these paired experiments on pigeons, and these are what the results look like, or these are what basically comes off of the PET scanner, I should say. So it produces these heat maps of the brain with red identifying the most active parts of the brain. And then we can overlay these heat maps onto neuroanatomical atlases. And essentially what we do is we draw lines around the regions that we're interested in, the parts of the brain that we're most interested in. And we can then quantify the changes in activity within these regions from rest to flight. And so here are, I'm not going to make you read this. This is a chart showing our results. What really struck me about these results is that overall for the most part, we had a pattern of stasis. So there was very little change in the brain of these birds from rest to flight. Where we saw all of the significant increases concentrated was within the cerebellum. And the cerebellum, if you remember from earlier in the talk, is this part of the brain that is coordinating movements, as well as it's helping control orientation, coordinating movements, smoothing movements, planning movements. So it makes a lot of sense that the cerebellum would be highly involved in flight as a locomotor activity. And it's doing all of this in response to sensory information that is coming into the cerebellum. We looked at regions of the brain. We were also, like I said, birds are very visual animals. So we were also interested in if there were particular visual pathways that were more active than other pathways during flight. So they're actually birds, actually us as mammals as well, we have multiple visual pathways within the brain, controlling different features of our visual abilities. So when we looked at the visual pathways in birds, what we found is that their primary visual pathway, the one that they use most of the time, didn't undergo a significant increase during flight, but it was always highly active, whether the bird was just sitting on a perch or whether the bird was flying back and forth. And that is because it's probably always important to the bird. So it's not just important to the bird during flight. It's important to the bird no matter what it's doing. The only significant increases that we saw were in these pathways called the optic flow pathways. And again, this makes sense, which is always a good thing. Um, but the optic flow pathways are processing information that is moving across the retina. So it's processing movement across the retina, which you would expect to be highly active during flight. And like I said, that's exactly what we found. And so now we can say that the the flight story is basically one of the cerebellum. So it's playing this critical role in coordinating movements in response to the sensory information that's coming into it. And that includes that optic flow information. In fact, a lot of the signal that we see in the cerebellum is probably related to that optic flow information. And so now we've got our story. So we've got the cerebellum seems to be the primary region that's active during flight. We've tied that to the anatomy. Now let's look a little bit at the deep history of the brain. Um, and now we can ask this question. We can ask a more refined question at this point. So instead of asking how does brain size relate to flight, we can now ask how does cerebellar size relate to flight? And so just to remind you, here's our hypothesis for the evolution of powered flight potential. This group here, para-aves. And when we look at the non-avian taxa for relative cerebellar size, so this is cerebellar size relative to total brain size, what we find is that there is a shift, there is an increase in cerebellar size in the fossil record, but it's actually at this group called Pinoraptora, which precedes para-aves and precedes the origin of flight. So once again, here's para-aves. So and Pinoraptora is just right here. So it's this group, it's this larger group that would include para-aves, but actually diverges before para-aves does. So what's going on here? Why do we get this increase in cerebellar size at Pinoraptora? Well, within Pinoraptora, we have this group called, I always hesitate to say this name. It's really one of the hardest names to say. Scansoriopterigidae. Yeah, try saying that one 5 times fast, right? So Scansoriopterigidae, these guys look like this. And so they have these membranous wings, and these are relatively newly discovered fossils from China. And although they most likely weren't capable of powered flight, they were probably undergoing some sort of gliding flight. And so whether you're flying whether you're flying under your own power or you're gliding from tree to tree, you're still navigating those same sensory, basically a similar sensory landscape. You're still moving through complex environments. And so when we see that increase in the cerebellum at Pinoraptora, it's probably because all of these animals are living in similar types of arboreal environments. And so, what we can say is that, we see that increase in cerebellar size is probably related to the origin of flight and kind of all of its forms. So where I really see the importance, of this work is drawing these direct lines of inference between neurophysiological data, the neuroanatomical data, and the deep history of the brain that we see in Endocast, because it's through these types of integrative cross-disciplinary studies that we can really appreciate the neurological basis of major evolutionary transformations. And so, with that in mind, I am going to really quickly take us through one more transformation that I think plays a role in the evolution of flight. And that is this structure called the vulst. Volst is a German, you may have guessed, it's a German word. And it means bump or bulge. And it's this expansion of the top of the cerebrum in birds. And the volst, the part of the cerebrum that it develops from, is the same part of the cerebrum that the neocortex develops from in mammals. So it's probably shares a deep evolutionary history with the neocortex. And we do know something about what the function of the volst is in living birds. And so the volst has a region in the posterior or the back of its of the volst that is processing visual information, and specifically visual information about orientation. And in things like owls that have frontally placed eyes, it's processing three-dimensionality. The Volsa also has a more anterior, or a region at the front of it, that is processing somatosensory information, or information about touch that's coming in from the body. That same part of the Volse has motor neurons that are actually descending within the brain and going to the anterior most parts of the spinal cord. So those parts of the spinal cord that are controlling the forelimb. And so the Volst was one of these things that was always thought to be a key characteristic of birds. So it hadn't been described outside of birds. Um, until, of course, I did the endocast for this specimen here, which is a troodontid, also collected from the Gobi Desert in Mongolia. And within this unnamed still unnamed, but this unnamed troodontid, we see a dorsal expansion of the cerebrum, very similar to what we see within living birds. So it seems like there is a volst within this troodontid. And so once I saw this, I was kind of like, well, maybe I should go look at some of these other endocasts of other non-avian dinosaurs and see if maybe I just missed the volst in these other guys. I mean, which wouldn't be surprising, because you would expect in the early history of some of these features, it's not going to be as prominent as it is in living birds. And actually, in some living birds, you can't see it very well on the endocasts either. But when I went back and looked at these non-avian, other non-avian dinosaurs, what I found is that there is evidence of a volst in other troodontids as well as other oviraptorosaurs, which means we can pull the origins of the volst down to this group called Maniraptora. And so, what is a volst doing in the fossil record? So, what are these dinosaurs doing with their volst? So, think back to what I said about the functioning of the volst. You have these visual zone, you have a somatosensory zone bringing in information from the body, and these two types of sensory information are being integrated and informing those motor neurons how to move the forelimb and manipulate the hand. And this is almost exactly how we as humans have very dexterous hands. It's because we have these direct pathways from the cortex to the muscles, essentially, or the spinal cord, controlling the muscles that control the hands. And so we see these same types of pathways that have been convergently evolved within birds and potentially some of these non-avian dinosaurs. And actually, we shouldn't be surprised to see these expanded somatosensory cortex and motor cortex within these Maniraptoran dinosaurs, because it's all in the name. Mani means hand, and then raptor. But this is the point on the tree where we see this very large expansion of the hand. And there have been all sorts of hypotheses about what these dinosaurs might have been doing with their hands. But all of these hypotheses involve some level of fine motor control. And what this may represent, what the Volst may represent, is a neurological basis for that motor control. And of course, what else do you need fine motor control of the forelimb for? Well, using a wing to fly. And so, what we might be looking at here is an important step in the evolutionary construction of the modern flight apparatus and its neurological basis. And so, this is where I normally end my talk, but I just want to show you all some new data that we have because it's very cool. We have been looking at pterosaurs recently, and what we see in pterosaurs is that they also have a dorsal expansion of the cerebrum where you would expect to see a vul. So it seems like, and this happens in these pterosaurs that have these huge wings. And remember, they have somatosensory structures on their wings. I told you that they have these feather-like structures. And so as the wing gets bigger, it seems like all of that somatosensory information is increasing the number of neurons in the vulse and or in the cerebrum. And so you get the evolution of a vulse in birds and pterosaurs independently. So we have convergent evolution going on in the brain in these flying animals. All right. Well, with that, I just want to say thank you for listening and bearing with me through this talk. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. That was wonderful. You can unshare. We'll
Okay.
come back together. We'll do Q&A and I'll put a big spotlight on you. Here we go. All right, we're gonna spotlight you. And you started off with you ended with the pterosaurs, and that's what I was gonna ask is the cerebellum in the pterosaurs similar or not because they're so different?
So the cerebellum so we do see an increase in the size of the cerebellum in pterosaurs as well. So where we see that increase, so we see just an overall increase in the size. There's also an increase in they have these huge, they have a huge flocculus, and what the flocculus is doing is processing different types of movement. So it's processing orientation, kind of our sense of orientation. So as you rotate or move, you translate in a plane. The flocculus is processing all of that information, and it basically keeps our heads from like wobbling around. um, and so, yeah, we see the same types of structures in the cerebellum also increasing in size in pterosaurs and birds.
Okay. Um, okay. And now we'll open it up for Q&A. If you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. And we have one earlier on. Jillian was asking, was the wishbone a pre-adaptation that was repurposed for flight?
So, yes. That is probably correct. I can't remember. I don't, and honestly, what the structural or functional significance was of these early dinosaurs fusing their clavicles together. I forget, if there is even if there is an explanation for that, but it happens, and it's something that birds take advantage of. And so they use this fusion to they incorporate it into the flight apparatus. And so yeah, it's one of those things, what we call an exaptation, something that was existed before and then gets incorporated and selected for another function.
Curious what insights could come or have come from looking at brain flight connections in mammals like bats, as in similarities, differences to avian flight.
That's a great question. Of course, there are only three groups of vertebrates that can fly. So pterosaurs and birds, but then of course mammals have powered flight as well. So bats can fly as well. And what we see is that there are some similarities between birds and bats in that they both increase parts of their cerebellum. But what's happening in bats is a little bit different, and specifically in the echolocating bats are kind of the most interesting to me because what they do is they increase the size of the auditory region, so where auditory information is coming into the cerebellum. And of course, that makes sense for echolocating bats that are using auditory or information about hearing to orient themselves in their environments. So a lot of it has to do with how these different animals are actually orienting and navigating the environments around them. So birds are visual; they have these optic flow pathways that increase in size and activity, whereas bats are navigating their world using auditory or information about sound coming in from their environment.
Very cool. Alan, you have your hand up.
Hi. So I have my standard question. I'll wait and ask that. But I was going to ask about bats, but since that was asked, my second ask was about flying squirrels. It reminded me of one of those earlier dinosaurs you said that might have glided. And so
Mhm.
I was thinking of that. So once you answer that one, my standard question is just how you got interested in this area, at whatever time in your life, however young or old you were when you really got interested in this area, interested in knowing. Thanks.
Yeah, so honestly, I haven't looked at the brains of flying squirrels, but it's an obvious kind of next place to go, right? And so that is something that I would be very interested in looking at. And my guess is that they would probably be different from bats because they're probably using different sensory modalities to explore their environment. So they may be using vision, they may be using some other sensory information, but I bet they do it a little bit. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw similar patterns in that the information is coming into the cerebellum and helping inform the cerebellum about how to plan out movements. But it's probably different types of sensory information. And that's what's so cool about this. It's like everybody's using some different type of sensory information to explore their surroundings. Oh, and then how did I get in I almost forgot the second part of the question. Um, so what, I always watched nature shows and things when I was a kid. I always enjoyed watching nature shows, but I didn't really think about it as a potential career or anything like that until I got to college and I took a class my freshman year, actually first semester, called The Age of Dinosaurs, and it was taught by Tim Rowe, who would eventually be my master's advisor at the University of Texas. And so I just really enjoyed his class, and I just, I didn't realize that that was an option that you could actually do this for a living. And when I found out that it was possible, I kind of never looked back. I just took more classes in geology and biology, and just kept going. And so here I am. Yeah, here I am now.
Well, just to let you know how that lines up with one of the other answers I got from an earlier presenter, at least you made a choice, based on, okay, it looked interesting. There was another one who made a choice because there were long lines for some other stuff. So he just got on the shorter line, and that turned out to be the
Right.
area.
Well, that was a lucky line then.
All right, Preston, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
So, it's basically the same question about the flying squirrel. There's such thing as flying snakes. I'm the snake guy, so I know about these sort of things. But they actually glide. But for a minute, you were talking about how birds are good at predicting where they predicting how they can land and stuff, like what's going to happen. Is there a similarity of the flying snake's brain to the bird brain?
That's a good question. Yeah, again, I would be very interested in looking at the brain of a flying snake. I don't know that anyone's really done that yet. Maybe someone out there has, but not that I've run across. That would be a really interesting model to look at. I think that yeah, it's a very different. If I kind of remember how the flying snakes work, they kind of fling themselves, um, and so I don't know how they're experiencing their environment. Snakes have really interesting sensory capabilities, so they have more they actually have more sensory capabilities than we do as mammals or even birds do. So it'd be really interesting to look at snakes and see how that is, how these sensory abilities are being used during their gliding flight. But I don't know the answer to that. It's something that we should look into.
Maybe when I become a snake expert, I'll look into that.
I think that's a great idea. I think that is a fantastic idea.
Thanks.
Thanks, Preston. I have a question about now that you're looking at the intricacies of the bird brains across species, and uh, are you able to make any distinctions amongst the brains and habitat of the birds, other patterns, other behaviors of specific birds that then can be used to backtrack onto the fossils that may be found and the indicasts that are done to make more connections or inferences.
Yeah, so a lot of we can actually tell a lot about the sensory capabilities of animals from their endocasts. So one thing that we can see if we're just looking at overall brain size is that birds like crows and parrots they have really large brains. In fact, the largest brains of any birds relative to their body sizes. So not surprisingly, it's almost all cerebrum because these are very, very smart birds. And these are birds, parrots can mimic and talk, but they're also just incredibly intelligent birds. And crows are just these birds that are kind of scary smart, right? So they're the ones that are like problem solvers. They can figure out how to get food out of like locked boxes, and they're just really interesting, really smart birds. And so they have a very large cerebellum. So their cognitive abilities are very high. But we can also tell, from other birds, we can look at like the optic lobes. So those are the parts of the brain that are processing visual information. And in something like a kiwi, which is a nocturnal bird that doesn't have very good visual capabilities, the optic lobes are tiny, like teeny tiny, but they also have very large olfactory bulbs for birds. So they're relying more on a sense of smell. And if you look at the internal structure of the brain, they actually have a very large nucleus within their brain that's processing information about touch that's coming in from the beak. So they're using their beaks to kind of scavenge around in the leaf litter and looking for bugs. So they can smell them and they can actually feel the movement of these bugs coming, as it disturbs like little bristles on their beaks. So yeah, you can look at the brain. You can actually tell quite a bit about the sensory evolution of particular birds. And yeah, and we can use that. We can look in the fossil record too and see, oh, T-Rex had really big olfactory bulbs. It probably had a pretty good sense of smell. The cerebrum's small, it's smallish, I guess. Maybe not the smartest. Maybe not the smartest dinosaur, but still probably a pretty good predator nonetheless.
The question came in. Has there been a comparison of brains between birds that move through all types of environments, such as cormorants versus birds that are basically terrestrial flying?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is that when you look at, especially, I can talk about like birds like, especially penguins, like their brains look very, they're essentially flying through water, and so their brains look very similar to other flying birds. What's interesting though is that something like an ostrich, its brain does not look that different from another flying bird. And what's probably happening there is that it starts like we talked about with the wishbone, that gets incorporated into flight. Well, these parts of the brains actually, they're being used for all sorts of things, not just flight. And so, they don't when they lose their ability to fly, it doesn't necessarily that mean that they're going to also their brain's going to revert back to look like a cursorial or a kind of a dinosaur that was walking or moving around in two dimensions, because things like ostriches have these long wings with lots of feathers on them. And so a lot of these structures that we think of as being important for flight are still probably important for ostriches, just in other ways than flight. They're moving their arms around in courtship displays and things like that. So those structures and pathways are probably still important, even though they've lost that ability to fly. I hope that makes sense. Once you lose the ability to fly, doesn't mean that your brain reverts back to it's a non-flying brain or a dinosaur brain, I should say.
Yeah, let's give some props to the flightless birds that what we started off with in
Exactly.
our icebreaker question.
Well, I'll
Go
say
ahead.
for my master's, I actually studied the elephant bird from Madagascar, which is an extinct flying bird from Madagascar.
Yeah, we have a cast of the elephant bird egg at the museum. So people
Oh,
always
nice,
next
nice,
to an
nice.
ostrich egg, and it people always ask about that. So yeah. All right. Any other questions tonight for Dr. Balanoff? Okay, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for taking time to share this incredible research with us. And everybody else, stay well, stay curious. I think next week, if I'm correct, we have our talk on the naturalist Thomas Say. So come back for that. And I think buy your raffle ticket so that we can keep these collections safe and sound. Um, and wish us luck in Annapolis as we go back next week for the house side of things. So take care, everybody. Stay well, stay curious, stay outside, and bird brains. We gotta change that thing. Birds are really smart.
Really.
I want a bird brain.
It's not a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing. No, no. So take care, everybody. Good
Okay,
night.
thank you.